They told you poverty looks a certain way: dirty hands, begging eyes, maybe a hungry belly. But they never told you poverty could be silent, could walk upright, could clean your house so well it felt like an exorcism. That's how she came into his life, not as a beggar, not as a woman, but as a ghost that didn't ask to be seen. He gave her a coin, just one, silver, minted, still cold from his palm. She took it without looking up. She didn't speak. She never did. She wiped his floorboards like she was removing something ancient and terrible from the wood. Blood, perhaps, or memory. When she vanished that first evening, Eli Mercer didn't think much. Men like him didn't. Widowed 5 years, ex-cattle runner turned surveyor, he'd settled into silence like an old coat. But something about her gnawed at the edges of his sleep. Not beauty, not pity, just a question. Who scrubs a man's cabin with the same focus one uses to stitch a wound? And why did it feel like she wasn't cleaning dirt, but hiding it? Weeks passed. She returned, always at dusk, always alone. He never saw her approach, only ever saw her walking away. Then he followed. And that's when he saw the ruin. Not the kind you fix with lumber, but the kind that lives inside bone. A half-collapsed shack. 5 children, not speaking, not crying, just surviving, like little soldiers raised in war zones you don't read about. The eldest boy had a voice too calm. The toddler stumbled barefoot through frost. She, Myra, was cooking over an open fire with nothing but scraps and determination, and still she had come to his cabin to clean. Eli watched from the ridge, and something inside him broke. No, not broke. Snapped into place. Like realizing you've been reading the wrong language your whole life, and suddenly someone speaks the truth. This wasn't charity. This was something deeper. Why had she chosen to return to age? His cabin? Why clean in silence for a man she didn't know? Why did it feel like she was cleaning the scene of a crime no one else had witnessed? She wasn't running from poverty. She was running from something older, something darker, and Eli Mercer had just stepped into it. Eli Mercer didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed listening to the wind claw at the cabin walls, wondering what kind of silence a woman like Myra had learned to carry. Not the kind born of shyness. No, this was battlefield silence. The silence of someone who knew sound could summon danger. The silence of someone who had once screamed and regretted it. He rose before dawn and nailed a sack of flour to a post near her home. He left without waiting for thanks. Something told him she wouldn't give it. When she returned days later, she didn't mention it, didn't look at the flour, didn't nod in acknowledgement. She cleaned his cabin the way she always did, with a kind of sacred brutality, like she was erasing sin from the walls. Eli noticed her hands, not soft, not raw, but scarred in a way you don't earn from housework. Burn marks, knuckle calluses, a scar along the wrist, thin and precise, the kind left by something sharp or surgical. That's when he realized. Myra had not only escaped something, she had survived it, and that changes a person. Survivors wear their memories like hidden armor. Every movement, every gesture is coded. She never turned her back to the window, never let her children sleep far from reach, never asked for more than what was silently offered, not because she was humble, but because she had once been punished for needing. One day, the boy came, 10, maybe 11. He stood on Eli's porch with a basket of eggs and a note in a shaky hand. For the help, that's all we can give. Thank you. No name, no request, just debt, paid in kindness. That night, Eli sat by the fire and stared at the coin she always left on the table. Untouched, shiny, like guilt made solid. What kind of world makes a woman this careful? What kind of man lets it happen? He wasn't looking for redemption. Men like him had long ago stopped believing in second chances. But something about Myra made the silence in his cabin feel louder, made the empty chairs feel shameful. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything began to shift, not with violence or revelation, but with a cracked egg, a quiet note, and a decision. He would follow again, not out of curiosity, but because somewhere along the way, he had begun to hope. The snow came fast that winter, heavy, wet, and mean, the kind that bent trees and broke roofs. Eli Mercer had seen it before, weather that didn't just test a man's strength. It tested what he valued. And Myra didn't come. Not on Monday, not Wednesday, not even Friday when she usually appeared like clockwork. Eli waited, boots by the door, kettle simmering, pretending he wasn't counting hours. He told himself she'd stayed back because of the cold, but a part of him, that old cattle runner instinct, whispered otherwise. By the third day, he saddled his mule before dawn and rode into the hills. No trail, just gut and memory. The path she used wasn't marked. It was barely more than deer tracks and luck, but he followed the signs, snapped twigs, a child's mitten half buried in snow, until he reached the crumbling remains of the miner's shed. Smoke should have risen from the chimney. There was none. He dismounted and ran. Inside, the children huddled beneath moth-eaten quilts, eyes wide and silent, as if waiting for something worse than frostbite. Myra was gone. "Where is she?" Eli asked. The oldest boy, Nathan, spoke quietly. "She went for help. Yesterday." She hadn't come back. Eli didn't wait. He turned around, mounted up, and pushed west, through thickets and brush that hadn't seen human footsteps in weeks. It was almost dusk when he saw her, collapsed beneath a pine, one leg twisted, blood seeping into the snow, still breathing, but barely. Her lips were cracked. Her voice was dry. "I was coming back," she whispered. That was all. He didn't speak, just lifted her gently into the saddle and walked the mule home by hand, mile after frozen mile, her head against his chest, her body fever warm in the storm. That night, the cabin glowed. He lit every lamp, stoked every fire, laid every quilt on the floor. The children came, silent and shivering, carried one by one in a wagon he barely managed to pull. They didn't cry, didn't ask questions. They just existed, small, watchful, alive. Eli wrapped Myra in his blankets and sat beside her bed through the night, listening to her breathe, watching the shadows move across the walls. For the first time in 5 years, the cabin was full, and for the first time in his life, Eli Mercer wasn't. Alone, 3 days. That's how long the storm held them hostage. Snow packed the windows like fists. Ice climbed the walls like fingers, and inside that cabin, time slowed to something ancient, something primal. Eli rose before dawn each day, stoked the fire until it cracked loud enough to wake the dead. He boiled water, scraped oats into a dented pot, and listened to the strange new sounds of life echoing in rooms that once held only silence. The children were soft-footed. They moved like shadows. Nathan helped chop wood without being asked. Lissa folded Eli's shirts after drying them by the fire. Ben checked the door latches like a soldier. Tommy curled into corners, watching, always watching. And Clara, the smallest, left her thumb in her mouth, and her other hand wrapped around Myra's apron even while she slept. But it was Myra who haunted the space between hours. She lay in Eli's bed, pale and motionless, her arms splinted with a piece of his old shirt, her lips too cracked for comfort. Fever took her halfway to the edge more than once. Each time Eli dabbed her forehead, whispered things he hadn't said since his wife died. Things like please and just hold on. He didn't know what Myra had survived before she came to him. but he was starting to understand its weight and its silence. It was the bruises, still faint on her ribs, the way she flinched at loud noises or jerked from dreams she never spoke of, the way the children responded to danger, not with panic, but preparation. They weren't scared of storms, they were scared of men. They had been trained by terror. Eli didn't ask questions, but he saw the scars. He saw the way Nathan positioned himself between Myra and the door, the way Lissa carried a sewing needle like it was a blade, the way Myra, even half-conscious, stirred when she heard boots thud on floorboards, as if ready to run. On the fourth thesis, "Each morning," Myra sat up. Her voice was thin but sharp. "I told you not to follow me," she said, not looking at him. Eli didn't reply at first. He was checking her bandage, tightening the knot gently. "You told me a lot of things," he finally said, without saying a word. She winced as he finished the knot. "You should have left us there." "I did," he said, "once, and that was the truth. But he wasn't that man anymore. He couldn't be, not now." That night, Eli found Nathan sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in one of his old coats, knees pulled to his chest, eyes lost in the dark. He looked like a child, but not the kind that ever got to be one. Eli didn't say a word. He sat beside him. The wood was cold beneath them, and the moon hung low like a hanging lamp in an executioner's cell. Silent, white, watching. "She doesn't sleep much," Nathan finally said, voice low. Eli nodded. "She gets up when she thinks we're all out, checks our shoes, our coats, packs food into sacks. She always thinks she's going to have to run again." He said it like a fact, not a complaint, not a question, just truth from a boy who had grown up measuring footsteps and reading door creaks like weather signs. "You ever ask her why?" Eli asked. Nathan shook his head. Didn't have to. And there it was. The kind of understanding you don't get from books or sermons, only from firelight and scars. These children didn't need explanations. They carried the weight of memory in their bones. The kind of weight only built in homes without safety, or fathers who didn't know the meaning of restraint. They sat there in silence for a while longer. Then Nathan did something Eli would remember for the rest of his life. He leaned over and rested his head, just lightly, on Eli's shoulder. It only lasted a second, but in that second, something shifted. In both of them. Trust. Unspoken. That week, Eli fixed the old sled behind the barn, repaired its broken runners, and patched it with bits of rope and wood. He didn't say why, just hitched it to the mule and rode into town. Wren Valley was cold and gray that morning. The shopkeeper raised a brow when Eli hauled back 2 sacks of flour, 3 loaves of hard bread, and a half-cured ham. "Expecting company?" the man asked. Eli paused. "Cousin's kin," he muttered. "He paid in silver, didn't we owe?" Buy it for change. When he returned, Myra was near the fire, her hair still damp from washing, Clara curled against her chest. She didn't ask where he'd been, just watched as he dropped the supplies near the hearth. "You're not obligated," she said. "Neither are you," he replied. And somehow, that was enough. They didn't name it. They didn't have to. But something had taken root. And for once in his life, Eli let it grow. Myra stopped leaving after supper. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no binding word between them, just a slow, silent shift. Like the season changing in a place too old for calendars, she cleaned the same way she always had, quiet, precise, disappearing when the last light faded from the windows, except now she stayed. The children, too, began moving like they belonged. Ben asked if he could sleep in the loft. Lissa started keeping track of their meals, portioning dried beans and hard bread like a quartermaster. Nathan began helping Eli repair the broken coop out back. Even little Clara stopped flinching when a door closed too hard. Myra never said she was staying. She just began mending the seams of Eli's shirts without asking. She took to the garden, planting roots in the soil like she wasn't expecting to flee before harvest. When Eli left tools out, he'd find them wiped clean and laid neatly by the door. When Clara caught a fever, Myra stayed up all night with a cool cloth, whispering lullabies Eli didn't recognize. And still, she never said a word about permanence. But it was there. In the scent of bread baking in the fire-warmed oven, in the way Nathan tied the water buckets with new rope, in the drawing Clara left on the mantel, a crude sketch of the cabin with 6 stick figures standing out front. One of them had a rifle slung across its shoulder. Another held what looked like a loaf of bread. That one, Eli realized, was him. They took up space, real space. His floor creaked more. His fireplace burned faster. The room felt smaller, warmer, alive. But it wasn't the noise that changed him, not the footsteps or laughter. It was the quiet gratitude, the way Nathan nodded when handed a plate, the way Lissa folded his shirts and left them on the cot without a word, the way Tommy handed him half of a wooden toy he'd carved as if saying, "You're part of us now." These were children who'd learned to pay for every ounce of kindness. And Myra still hadn't said what she'd run from. She didn't have to. Eli saw it in the bruises that lingered beneath her collarbone, in the way her hand jerked when boots echoed across wood, in the way she flinched, not at fists, but at silence. By the time spring thawed the last ridge of snow, Eli knew 2 things. He would kill for them, and if it came to that, he would bury the man who made her afraid. It was peace, but peace like a candle left burning in an old barn, beautiful, flickering, and doomed if no one watched it. 2 weeks passed before the outside world came knocking. The first was a woman, older, face like sour milk, her spine straight as her tongue was sharp. She rode up to the cabin midday, dust caked on her boots and judgment bleeding from her eyes. Didn't bother with a greeting, didn't take off her gloves, just looked at Eli like he was a rat squatting in someone else's home. "You seen a woman, name of Myra Jansen?" she asked, tight-lipped. Eli didn't answer. He just stared, arms crossed, thumb grazing the edge of the axe leaning near the door. "I'm her cousin. Her husband's worried sick. Said she ran off, took the children. No warning, no reason. He's beside himself." Eli still didn't speak. The woman's eyes narrowed. "You hiding her?" "Lady," Eli said, his voice low, like thunder before a flood. "If I was, I wouldn't tell you." That was the end of that. She turned her horse and vanished into the trees, but Eli didn't rest easy. That night, he rode the ridgeline himself, long loop through the woods, scanning for fresh tracks, listening for hooves on rock. He told Myra what happened. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't fall into him like a girl from some fool's story. She just pulled the children closer that night and whispered to them in a tongue Eli didn't understand, soft, lilting, not quite English, not quite anything. He didn't ask what she said. Some things aren't meant for men to know. The next morning, he built a hidden latch in the pantry floor, trapdoor to the crawl space below, not big, but enough to hide 6 if someone ever came banging at the door. When he showed her, Myra just nodded once. No thanks, no explanation, just understanding, deep and old as the bones buried beneath Wren Valley. For a while after that, things settled again. Spring crept in, slow and shy. Snow melted off the eaves. Myra moved easier, her arm no longer bound tight. The kids ran barefoot in the thawed grass. Laughter returned, not loud, but real. But Eli knew what men like Roland Jansen were. They didn't stop. They didn't forget. They circled like wolves, waiting for the warmth to make you soft. And Eli Mercer, quiet, widowed Eli, who hadn't raised his voice in 5 years, kept his rifle oiled, his boots by the bed, and his back never turned to the door. Because something was coming, and he intended to meet it standing. It started with the dog. Eli hadn't kept one in years, not since the cattle days when a good dog meant the difference between a quiet night and a slaughtered pen. He never needed one, not until now. So when Nathan returned from the northern ridge with a half-starved mutt trailing behind him, ribs sharp, eyes too alert to be tame, Eli said nothing, just nodded once and opened the door. They called him Scout. He was quiet, watchful, moved like he'd been hunted once and hadn't forgotten. He took to sleeping on the porch, head up, nose twitching at every rustle in the trees. Lisa brushed his coat every night with quiet reverence. Ben tried teaching him tricks. Clara offered her crusts at breakfast like he was a prince at court. But it wasn't the dog that made Eli feel safer. It was the way Myra looked at him, like something inside her, tight and twisted, had finally loosened. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes settled. She even smiled once when she thought no one was watching. That's when Eli realized something deeper was shifting. She wasn't turning into someone else. She was becoming who she had been before. The way her spine held steady, the way she began humming low songs while folding clothes, the way she looked out the window without flinching every time a branch cracked. Her voice, when it came, was no longer cautious. It was decisive. "Your eastern fence is sagging," she said one morning, nodding toward the tree line as she peeled carrots. "Foxes'll take your chickens by next frost if you don't mend it." Eli blinked. "I thought you didn't care for the animals." "I care about breakfast," and that was that. But even as the family began to stitch itself together like old cloth turned into something whole, Eli felt it. That pressure in the air, the silence too clean, like a breath being held too long. He'd seen it before. You can build peace, yes, but peace is a structure, and structures can be shaken, broken, burned. Nathan laughed once, a loud, boyish thing, and Myra whipped her head toward the sound like she couldn't believe it came from her own blood. Clara drew stick figures in the dirt with wild yellow hair and square little cabins. Even Tommy had stopped hiding when strangers passed on the trail. But Myra had begun to walk slower through the house. Her fingers lingered on folded maps. Her gaze drifted too long toward the hills beyond the ridge. She was planning something. Eli knew the signs. He'd once done the same. Eli didn't ask. Not yet. But he started noticing every detail, like a man watching smoke before the fire. Myra's movements were quieter, slower, not from fatigue but calculation, like a woman counting the weight of everything she touched, measuring what she could carry if she had to flee. Again. He'd seen it before, in soldiers, in widows, in men who'd been on the run so long they forgot what stillness felt like. One morning he caught her in the pantry, not taking, not stealing, just staring at the jars, the sacks, the tools hanging by rusted nails. She wasn't inventorying supplies, she was imagining them gone. That night, he heard her crying, not sobbing, not desperate, just a soft, aching sound, like something cracked inside her finally gave way. It was muffled behind the bedroom door, half lost in the creak of wind and firewood. Eli didn't go in. He sat by the hearth instead, back to the wall, Scout curled at his feet, listening. He didn't sleep, neither did she. At dawn, she was gone. Not far, just up the ridge trail by the creek, knees in the frost, hair braided tight, hands still in her lap. Eli followed without sound, sat beside her on the frozen earth. She didn't turn, not at first, but when she did, her eyes weren't soft, they were sharpened. I thought about leaving, she said, her voice like ash, taking them, walking west, disappearing again. Eli didn't flinch, just watched the water trickle past stones and bone-white branches. Why didn't you? A long breath. Because I think you'd follow. I would, she nodded slowly. And I'm tired of running. That silence again. Not empty, earned, like a ceasefire after a war. Then she spoke, and it was like unraveling thread from an old wound. That man, Roland Jansen, he wasn't always cruel. At first he was just proud, the kind of pride that rots when it's never checked. Eli still said nothing. Jew just listened. He didn't want a wife. He wanted obedience. I gave it. Gave him children. That's when he got worse. Her fingers clenched the hem of her skirt. He'd vanish for days, come back angry. I never asked where he went. I only asked that he leave the children alone. She looked at Eli now, steel behind the sorrow. He didn't. Eli's jaw tightened. I took them when he was gone. Left a note. Hoped he'd never find us. But men like that, she whispered, they don't lose, they hunt. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. He already knew. That morning, Eli nailed shut the old cellar door behind the cabin. Not because it led to anything, just dirt and roots and the ghosts of canned peaches long gone, but because the kids had started asking questions. He boarded the west-facing window next, reinforced the latch on the pantry trapdoor, then quietly, almost like it wasn't happening at all, he sharpened every blade he owned. There was no announcement, no plan etched in stone. But Myra knew. She saw the way Eli's eyes followed the tree line now, how he paused longer near the porch railing, how Scout had started sleeping curled beneath the steps instead of the hearth. Something was circling, and the old part of her, the part that never quite unlearned how to survive in silence, felt it in her ribs like thunder before rain. Still, she never asked him about Roland again. She just moved through the days like a woman preparing to die well if she had to. Lisa braided Clara's hair tighter than usual. Ben kept a rock in his pocket, thumb always grazing the edges like it might turn to a knife. Nathan, who'd once flinched at the scrape of boots, now walked the perimeter before breakfast, a stick slung across his shoulder like a rifle. They didn't say danger. They didn't say escape. But the air had shifted. The quiet was loaded now. And then, one afternoon, Eli saw it. A figure at the top of the ridge, black coat, no horse, just a man standing still against the dying light. Watching. Eli didn't blink, didn't move, didn't breathe. But something primal crawled up the back of his neck like ice. He went inside, locked the door, didn't mention it. Not yet. That night, Myra was in the kitchen, feeding Clara soup with her left hand, the other still stiff from the break. You think he's close, she said without turning. It wasn't a question. I know he is. She nodded once, calm, as if she'd expected. That answer her entire life. Then, without a word, she walked over to the old rifle Eli kept near the fireplace, picked it up, checked the chamber, sighted down the barrel. I won't run again, she said. You won't have to, he answered. But both of them knew it wasn't that simple. Because some ghosts don't stop at the door. They break it down. It happened on a Thursday. The kind of day that smelled like wet pine and wood smoke, like something too quiet, too still, too clean. Eli had been splitting logs out back, Scout dozing nearby, when he heard it. The low, deliberate crunch of hooves on gravel. Not fast, not reckless, purposeful. He dropped the axe without thinking, wiped his hands on his shirt, and stepped to the front of the cabin. Myra was already there, eyes narrowed, lips tight. Nathan stood just behind her, jaw clenched, gripping that carved stick like it was a sword. The others were inside, silent, waiting.
Down the trail came 3 riders. One was Roland Jansen. He wore black, always did, but this time it looked deliberate, like a costume, like a death shroud pretending to be law. He sat tall in the saddle, arms relaxed, like he wasn't there to fight. But the stillness in his face said otherwise. The man to his right was older, lean, with a scar down one cheek and dead eyes, the kind who'd buried bodies, Eli thought. The other, barely a man, more a boy, twitched in his saddle like nerves were chewing through his skin. Eli stepped off the porch, the rifle slung across his back like a promise he was ready to keep. "You've come far, Jansen," he said. Roland removed his hat slowly, smiled. "Only as far as I needed to." He looked past Eli then, to Myra. Even from yards away, Eli saw her stiffen. "She yours now, Mercer?" Roland asked, voice smooth as oil. "You playing house with what ain't yours?" "She was never yours," Eli replied. Roland's eyes snapped back. "The law says different." "The law can go to hell," Myra said, stepping forward now. Her voice didn't shake. "And take you with it." That stopped Roland cold. For a moment, he just stared, like he was seeing her for the first time. Then his smile returned, slower, crueler. "You think this ends with a line in the dirt?" he asked. "You
Think you get to keep what's mine?" Eli stepped forward again, just one step. "Try to take her," he said, "and find out." No one moved. The forest held its breath. Even the wind seemed to lean in, waiting. Then Roland tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away, slow, measured, like he hadn't just made a threat. But Eli knew better. That was no retreat. It was a warning. A storm doesn't strike the first time you hear thunder. It waits until you've stopped watching the sky. The air never went back to normal after that. Something in it had shifted, like iron filings around a hidden magnet, invisible but impossible to ignore. Even the trees seemed to lean differently, as if they too were watching for riders from the east. Eli started sleeping less, not because of fear. He'd lived through worse than fear, but because vigilance had become instinct again. He checked the perimeter before dawn, walked the ridgelines at dusk, reinforced the pantry trapdoor until it could hold a bear if it had to. And Myra? She didn't speak much after Roland's visit, but she didn't run either. That, more than anything, told Eli just how far she'd come from the woman who once cleaned floors without lifting her eyes. Now she met him in the yard each morning, sleeves rolled up, jaw set, not to hide, to prepare. It wasn't until 3 days later that they saw the smoke. A thin black coil rising from the west, near the old logging road, not close enough to be immediate, but too close to ignore. Eli took Nathan and Ben and rode out before noon. Scout trailed them, nose low, body tense. What they found made the boy go pale. A camp. Empty, but not old. Embers still glowed in the fire pit. Boot prints circled wide around it. 3 sets. One of them limped. Another dragged something, a cane maybe, or a rifle butt, but the part that sent ice through Eli's spine was the line carved into the bark of a pine near the clearing. A single name scratched deep, Myra. He didn't say a word to the boys, just pointed. Nathan's face darkened with something too old for an 11-year-old. Ben kicked dirt over the coals, like that could erase what they'd seen. By the time they got home, dusk was falling. Myra met them at the porch, Clara on her hip. Eli simply nodded, and she knew. She didn't ask what they found, just went inside and started boiling water, setting out cloth, checking, bandages. Not out of panic, out of readiness. Later, Eli found her on the porch, watching the trees again. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. "He's not coming to talk this time," she said. "I know." "Then we don't wait," she said. Eli nodded slowly. Then we don't. And just like that, it became war. Not with armies, but with grit, silence, and a fire neither man nor monster could smother. They didn't speak of plans after that. Plans were for people who believed the future followed rules. What Eli and Myra were building was instinct, not strategy, like wolves digging dens before a storm they could smell but not see. The cabin transformed over the next 3 days, quietly, efficiently, as if it had always been meant for war. Nathan carved signals into tree bark up the ridge. Lisa tied ribbons of cloth to branches, each a different warning. Ben dug holes and filled them with dry thorns and shale, his own brand of defense. Myra cleaned the rifle, twice, then oiled the axe handle and laid it near the door like it belonged there. Eli reinforced the floorboards, moved dry goods into the crawl space, hid his wife's old wedding ring and a pocket Bible in the tin box under the hearth, not because he believed in prayers anymore, but because some items carried weight that bullets couldn't stop. On the 4th night, Scout began growling at nothing, low, guttural. Eli stepped outside and didn't even pretend to be casual anymore. The moon was fat, the hills silent. Even the wind refused to speak. He returned inside and barred the door. "That's tonight," he said flatly. Myra nodded. She didn't gather the children. She didn't cry. She simply tucked Clara deeper into the quilts and whispered something soft into her ear. Then she stood and faced the fire, jaw hard. Eli studied her. There was no fear in her. None left. Only resolve. The kind of resolve that no man can put in you, and no violence can ever take out. It had been forged somewhere far from here, in a place where silence was survival and running was routine. But this wasn't that anymore. She wasn't a woman who ran. Eli loaded the rifle, slowly, methodically. He laid the old revolver next to the bread box, slipped the hunting knife into his boot. Then he turned to Myra. "They'll come fast. I'll be faster." At that moment, Eli understood something he hadn't before. Not about Myra, but about himself. He wasn't fighting to protect her. He was fighting beside her. And in that split second of clarity, he felt the fear drain from his bones like thawed snow slipping off a roof. Let them come. They'd meet more than resistance. They'd meet ruin. The first man came at dawn. Not Roland. A scout. Maybe just a fool. Young, riding hard through the tree line like no one would challenge him. His horse moved with urgency, but his eyes scanned like a man searching for a ghost, not a gun barrel. He didn't make it past the eastern fence. Scout barked once, sharp, not panicked. Eli was already out the back door, rifle in hand, Myra watching from the loft window. Nathan, now armed with a slingshot and nerves hardened by purpose, ducked beneath the stairs with Ben. Lisa stayed by Clara and Tommy, one hand on the rifle Eli had shown her how to use, just in case never felt so close. Eli moved like a shadow, silent, ground measured. The scout dismounted by the fence, crouching, inspecting something. Didn't even sense the man behind him until it was too late. "I'd stop there," Eli growled. The scout turned, startled, hand drifting toward his coat. Eli raised the rifle, not shaking. "No need for that," the man said quickly. "No need for you either," Eli replied. "You lost?" "I'm just—" the man started. "You're just dead if you keep reaching for that iron," Eli said cold. "Hands in the air." The scout obeyed. Slowly, Eli took the pistol from his coat and tossed it down the hill. "You tell Roland Jansen he rides another mile toward my cabin. I'll hang him from the same tree he used to beat his wife." "You don't understand who he is," the scout whispered, eyes darting. "Oh, I understand exactly. That's why I'm ready." Eli let him go, barely. The man ran like death chased him. Maybe it did. Back at the cabin, Myra was waiting on the porch, barefoot, hair braided like armor. "Did he talk?" she asked. "Enough." She nodded, not needing more. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the coffee cup Eli handed her, but her eyes? They burned like coals under ash. "They'll come harder next," she said. "I hope." So, that was the shift. No more hiding, no more fleeing. This wasn't survival anymore. This was reckoning. Whatever Roland had been, whatever power he once held, he was about to meet something he'd never seen before, a woman unafraid of hell, and a man who'd already lived through it. The wind changed direction the night before Roland came. It blew in from the north, cold, sharp, metallic, like breath off a blade. Eli stood on the porch long after the fire inside had died, staring out into the tree line. Scout lay motionless beside him, ears perked, not barking, just watching, as if he too knew the blood on the horizon wasn't just a memory anymore. Inside, Myra packed a satchel, not with fear, but with certainty. Bandages, a jar of boiled root, a small black book with no title. It wasn't for prayers. Nathan sat sharpening a knife, not asking questions. Lisa stitched the torn strap of her brother's boot. No one cried. No one panicked. They moved like a unit trained by trauma, fluent in the choreography of survival. At dawn, the riders came. 3 of them. Roland at the front, proud as ever, clean-shaven, dark coat, wide-brimmed hat. Behind him, a preacher and a deputy. That's how cowards ride, wrapped in symbols. They stopped 30 yards from the porch. Eli didn't move, rifle across his chest, calm, grounded. Myra stood beside him. She didn't flinch. Roland dismounted slowly, like a man savoring a victory he hadn't yet won. His voice was slick with rehearsed righteousness. "Myra," he said loud enough for the trees to hear, "you've had your little rebellion. Time to come home." The word home landed like a curse. Myra didn't answer. So Roland turned to the preacher. "Tell her. Tell them all. The law's on my side." The preacher, red-faced, clutching a weathered Bible, stepped forward. "In the name of the Lord, we—" "Stop," Eli said, voice cold, cutting. "You walk one step closer, I bury you with that book in your mouth." The preacher halted. Roland laughed, low and venomous. "You think you can keep her? Those children? You think the state, the church, the law, they'll all just look the other way?" "I don't think," Eli said. "I prepare." Behind him, the trapdoor opened. Nathan emerged, rifle in hand. Beside him, Lisa stood ready with the shotgun. Scout growled, low and steady. Roland's smile faded. "This ain't over," he said. Eli nodded. It never was. Then came the line Myra hadn't spoken in years. Her voice was sharp, clear. "You touch this land again, Roland Jansen, and they'll be digging a grave too wide to mark." She didn't blink, neither did Eli, because something stronger than law had been awakened. A sacred rage, the kind that doesn't need permission to survive. They didn't come back that day. Roland and his men turned their horses slow, not in retreat, but in recognition. They'd met something they didn't expect, not just defiance, but order, a line in the dirt carved by hands that had already buried too much to lose again. As their shadows faded down the trail, Eli didn't celebrate. Neither did Myra. Because when predators retreat, they're not surrendering, they're recalibrating. Inside the cabin, the children didn't ask what happened. They read it in their mother's eyes. In Nathan's knuckles, still white around the rifle. In Lisa's tears, quietly wiped as she folded the shotgun cloth. That night, the fire burned higher, not for warmth, but as signal. They were no longer hiding, they were waiting. Eli sat with Myra by the hearth, both too tired for words, yet too aware to sleep. Her hands shook slightly as she poured tea, not from fear, but from memory, from the taste of standing up, when all life ever taught her was to bow down. "I used to believe," she said, voice barely above the wind, "that silence kept people safe." Eli looked at her, but didn't speak. "I was wrong," she said. The flames cracked. "I've lived quiet my whole life. Thought if I never fought back, maybe nothing worse would come. But quiet women die in pieces, Eli. They disappear, one scar at a time." He stared into the fire, then let the silence end. And that's when she told him the truth. Not just about Roland, but about the church. About the preacher who came every second Sunday and left with blood on his boots. About the blessings that were really punishments. About the altar that held no scripture, only control. It wasn't just Roland who wanted her back. It was the men behind him, the doctrine, the system, the mask of righteousness they all wore. She'd seen too much, survived too long, and worst of all, she'd taught her children to think for themselves. That made her dangerous. That made her a heretic. That made her a story they had to erase. But Eli, and the fire growing inside that cabin, had become something else. A reckoning. Because sometimes history isn't written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by those who refuse to vanish. The snow melted too quickly that year. By mid-March, the creek overflowed its banks and soaked the lower fields in Wren Valley, a sign, some said, that the land was restless again. But Eli knew better. It wasn't the earth that stirred. It was the past, clawing its way back up through the frost-bitten roots, demanding to be seen. He began reinforcing the cabin like a man preparing for siege. New hinges on the back door, nails driven deep into old beams, windows now cross-barred, not just for cold, but for warning. Nathan asked no questions, just helped, his eyes older now. Lisa stitched bags of dried meat into the lining of their coats. Even little Ben kept his slingshot loaded, whispering plans to Tommy about how to signal with rocks if the bad ones came again. Only Clara remained untouched, drawing stick figures of dogs and stars, blissfully unaware. But Myra moved like a woman with a countdown in her blood. Each morning she checked the ridgeline. Each night she braided her hair tight and left her boots near the door. She no longer hid who she had been, and that's what made her more dangerous than ever. Because the Church of First Redemption, Roland's church, wasn't built to withstand women who remembered. Myra told Eli what they did to midwives, how they called them witches when births went wrong, how they blamed mothers for stillborns, for fevers, for tears that wouldn't stop, how Myra herself was almost cleansed at the age of 17 when she tried to deliver a baby born blue. The preacher had whispered prayers while holding her beneath the water. Roland held her down. They said they were baptizing her back into purity, but it was a drowning, and she'd never forgotten the bubbles of light that danced before she lost consciousness. That's when Eli knew this wasn't about running anymore. It was about ending it. He began sketching, a map of the valley on old parchment, marking every hollow, every trail, every blind bend where an ambush could be set, because men like Roland didn't return twice unless they brought righteousness with a rifle. And Eli wasn't just defending a home now. He was defending history, not the kind written in books, but the kind carved into the bones of people who refuse to forget. People like Myra, people like her children, people like him. They say the past dies in silence, buried beneath years and snowfall, but in Wren Valley, silence is where it festers. On the final morning, when the air was too still and even the birds dared not sing, Eli Mercer stood on his porch like a sentinel between peace and the return of terror. Roland Jansen came with 2 men, Not bounty hunters, too clean for that. Not kin, too cold. Just men who were paid to retrieve what another man claimed to own. The riders stopped 30 paces from the cabin. Roland dismounted with the ease of someone who'd already written the ending in his mind. He wore arrogance like armor. Eli didn't move. Neither did Myra. She stood beside him, back straight, rifle in hand, a quiet war behind her eyes. Roland called out, voice loud and false like a preacher at a dying sermon. "I've come for what's mine." Eli stepped forward. "You'll leave with the dust you brought." The men behind Roland shifted, unsure. Eli had made sure they would be. He'd ridden to town 3 nights ago, whispered enough about who Roland was and what he'd done. Fear spreads fast in places like this, and shame faster. Roland didn't blink. "You don't understand who I am. I understand you're standing too close to people who've already survived you once," Eli said. Myra raised the rifle, not aimed, yet, just held like a promise. Behind the cabin, Nathan had the children hidden in the pantry trapdoor, as practiced. Scout stood at the edge of the clearing, growling low. Then came the sound, a distant snap of brush. The sheriff, 4 townsfolk behind him, quiet, solemn, armed. Eli hadn't asked them. They'd come anyway, because sometimes a town remembers the cries it once ignored. Roland turned, finally uncertain. He glanced at the sheriff, at the gun in Eli's hand, at the woman who no longer flinched beneath his voice. "You'll regret this," he said, not like a threat, more laws. Like a man who realizes he's no longer feared. "No," Myra said quietly. "You will." They left. No fight, just distance growing with every hoofbeat. By nightfall, Myra stood by the fire, children asleep, Eli nearby. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I think we're ready now." And that's the truth, isn't it? Sometimes horror isn't ghosts or monsters. It's the silence people survive in. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what comes back. It's what you finally refuse to run from. If you've stayed this long, you're not the same. Comment, "I will not run again," twice below. You've heard what you weren't supposed to. Welcome to the Black Chapter.